Today we are finally getting to do a video that I've been wanting to do for a long time. Today I'm going to take you under the covers of an A-Star helicopter. I'm going to give you the guided tour, tell you everything about it, and it's going to be awesome. So make sure you stick around all the way through. Hi, I'm Rick James from the Pilot Teacher, and this is an A-Star helicopter. This is the one that I'm currently flying. So today we're getting under the covers and I'm going to give you a full guided tour from a pilot's perspective. So let's go take a look. So we're going to start at the front of the aircraft. There's kind of three main things on here that people always ask me about. One is the air vent here, two is the pitot tube, and then three is the string. The air vent is basically just exactly that. It's a vent that I can open from the cockpit to allow fresh air to come into the aircraft, and yeah, on a hot sunny day it is really welcomed nice breeze of air. The pitot tube is used to gather air going into it, and it gives me my indication for how fast I'm going through the air, so it feeds my airspeed indicator. And the string basically shows me how I'm flying through the air, and it's called trim. So here is our little helicopter. So trim is basically when I'm flying along, if the string is going straight up and down the window, the tail is following exactly behind me. If the string is off to one side, it means that I'm flying through the air like this or like this. So the string is just an easy little device that tells me that I'm flying in trim with the tail following directly behind me. So now we're going to start coming around the aircraft. The windows that you can see here is called a chin bubble window, and what that allows the pilot and the passenger to do is to look down towards your feet so you can see, because the approach that we take in a helicopter is often quite a steep approach. So we're looking down through the chin bubble window so we can see everything below us as we're coming in. Without those, you've got quite a bit of a blind spot by your feet, and that blind spot could hide trees or wires or anything like that. It's also really handy on the pilot's side because I have my mirrors, and the mirrors are basically there for two reasons. One is to look at my hook on the bottom, so when I'm flying within an external load, I can see one of the mirrors points to my hook, so I can make sure that when I lift off that my long line is connected to the hook, and the other mirror actually looks down at the actual load at the bottom, so when you're flying along you can make sure that the load is not oscillating and is flying nicely. So those are the mirrors, and that's what we use the chin bubble windows for. Okay, so coming around into the cabin, this A-Star is a 6-person helicopter. So we have the pilot seat on the right there, the passenger seat on the left, and then we have a bench where we can have 4 skinnier people. You get big burly dudes in there and they are shoehorned in, and I feel really sorry when I see 4 guys sitting back there, but hey, that's life. So yep, they all have a seat belt and they all have a headset. Each headset has what we call a push to talk button on there, so when they want to talk, just like using a radio or a walkie-talkie, they press and hold the button and then I can hear them in the front. The main flight controls are just on the right seat. We can put another setting in the left seat for training purposes. So under that black box there is where we connect in the flight controls, and the same with this panel in the floor here. It allows us to have dual pilot controls when we're doing training, things like that. The red thing down at the bottom there is our first aid kit, and then up in the top we have a fire extinguisher. And that is about it for emergency equipment in the front of the aircraft. I've got a good video which I'll link to at the end that gives you an actual guided tour of the interior and the instrument panel of the helicopter. So if you're interested in looking at what all the instruments do and what I'm going to be looking at, you'll be able to find that video linked at the end. So yeah, this is the interior, and it is basically 6 people. So the next thing that we have on most utility helicopters, I'm going to say. It's called a utility basket or a ski basket, and this is great for putting in cargo that's too big to fit inside, or we don't want it inside. So let's say if we're taking gasoline for chainsaws or gas powered generators or pumps, anything like that that's going to stink, we're going to stick it in there because we don't want it inside the cockpit. So yeah, the utility basket is a really helpful addition to a bushworking helicopter like this. From there we have got our first kind of cargo compartment. This one has mainly got my remote refueling gear in it. This cargo area, I can put in there about 264 pounds maximum of cargo, but like I said, it's just got my remote refueling gear. So I've got the fuel pump there, I've got spare filters and fluids in there. The hose is to go from the pump to the refueling nozzle on the aircraft, and then I've got an actual set of water and sediment filters so that it doesn't bring any junk out of a fuel barrel into the aircraft. So that's another video that you're going to be able to check out, is how do I refuel a helicopter in a remote location. So you can be able to check that out too. So just aft of the left-hand cargo bay is another cargo door, and in here it's called a tail boom cargo area. And this is the main one that a lot of our passengers use to put all their stuff in. As you can see, it's pretty empty at the moment. It's just got my blade tie downs and engine cover in there, but we can fit about 175 pounds maximum in here. We just make sure that none of the cargo or baggage that goes in here has any fluids in it, because under this floor here is where we have all our electronic boxes and avionics boxes for the aircraft. So any fluids that leak is going to cause problems, and I'm going to owe the engineer some serious beer if they have to come and fix that. So yeah, we generally put fluids in here and just lunches and backpacks and stuff in there. So yep, that's the tail boom cargo compartment. So here we have the left-hand transmission bay, and basically what it is in here is the main transmission for the helicopter. We have the engine over here providing power to the transmission through a drive tube, and engine comes in at about 6,000 RPM. So what the transmission does here is it changes the direction 90 degrees to go up to the main rotor head, and it also slows down the rotation. So normally in flight we're around about 394 RPM. So we go from 6,000 to 394. What we have here in the foreground is our fuel filter. So it comes up from the fuel tank below, comes through the fuel filter, and it's just like a first stage filter that helps to take any water or sediment out. And from there it then goes through into a second fuel filter, and we have our fuel shut-off valve just here. So if I have an engine fire, I can pull the fuel shut-off lever and it's going to close that valve, and it's going to stop any fuel going back into the engine compartment. Mounted on the transmission we have our flight controls. So we have a push-pull tube here, push-pull tube here, and one on the other side. We have three that come up from the flight controls, and these feed into the hydraulic actuators. It's basically like the power steering for the helicopter. So as I move the flight controls, it moves these push-pull tubes up and down, and it activates the hydraulic actuators that moves the rotor head. Here we just have our hydraulic lines that actually go into the transmission, and then it just keeps the hydraulic oil warm. Especially it's good when we're flying in the winter, because this thing flying without hydraulics when you're heavy and it's cold is really stiff. So by getting the hydraulic oil nice and warmed, it actually helps to fly it even better. In the front here we have a cooling fan. So we have in here a radiator at the front, and it takes air in through the front cowling there, and it just basically blows through and it cools that hydraulic oil and the engine oil. The fan is a temperature controlled fan, so it usually comes on around about 70 degrees Celsius. So when I'm flying along, I can hear the fan clicking on and off, keeping the engine oil and the hydraulic oil at the perfect temperature. At the back here you can just see is the hydraulic oil reservoir. We'll get into that more when we go around to the other side, it's a little bit easier to see. And then back here we have our rotor brake. So when I have finished flying and I've shut the aircraft down, I can pull on the rotor brake, and what that will do is just like a caliper, it's like a brake on a bicycle. I just pull on the lever, it clamps two plates together around the main transmission drive shaft, and it basically just slows the main rotor down. So it allows for passengers to get in and out quicker, things like that. So this is the left hand side transmission cowl, and as you can see it's nice and open, it's clean. The Eurocopter, or Airbus machines as they are now, they're designed really well so that they don't puke oil and grease anywhere. The Bell helicopters are horrendous, they've got grease thrown all over. So these are actually nice to work on because they're clean, they don't have any oil in. So it's nice and easy to see, nice and free, nice and open, nice and clean. Makes it really nice when you're doing your daily inspection so you don't get covered in oil and junk. So let's move on to the engine. So this is the Ariel 1D1 turbo shaft gas turbine engine, and it produces around about 730 horsepower for this B2 Astar. It's a really powerful, lightweight, highly efficient, very reliable gas turbine engine, and it allows me to lift some serious weight with the B2. And the new machines like the Astar B3, the B3E, they've got even more powerful engines and you can do even more with them. But for an Astar, this engine is awesome. So we'll start here up at the top. We have the engine air intake, and on the top of this cowling up here we have the engine intake filter, and that's just like a sand or a particle filter, helps keep the debris and dust out from the engine. And what that does is it funnels the air down into the front of the engine, which is right here. And the front of the engine is a axial compressor, and what that does is it compresses the air, so it increases its air pressure, and what it also does is increases the speed at which the air then goes into the next stage. The next stage right here is a centrifugal compressor, and what that does is it increases the pressure even further, and it also increases the temperature. So the air then goes from there into the combustion chamber, which is the big can right here. So the air is now compressed, it's at high pressure, it is now at a high temperature, and it gets fired into the combustion chamber. So here we have the spark igniter, and we have a fuel nozzle, and there's two of each, one on this, a pair on this side and a pair on the other side. So when I start the engine, I've got the starter button pressed, that's firing the starter igniters, so basically like a spark plug for your car, and that ignites the fuel. As the fuel gets ignited, it expands and it fires out the back end of the engine, just kind of like a jet engine, but this one's a little bit different. Once the engine gets up to about 45% of its RPM, I can release the starter and it's self-sustained. I don't need the igniters to run anymore. The fuel being fed in is constantly being reignited by the flame that's already in there. So the engine is now running by itself and will continue to run until I stop putting fuel into it. So in the combustion chamber, that air is now moving outwards, and what it does is it goes through into the power turbine section, and the power turbine section is what make this a turbo shaft engine. So what we have is two power turbine wheels in there. One of them drives the compressor at the front, and then the other one feeds into this gearbox here, and the gearbox then feeds the main drive shaft at 6,000 RPM that feeds into the main transmission, and it also feeds off down to the back end of the helicopter to drive the tail rotor drive shaft. So these are two completely free turbines, as they're called. They're not mechanically connected to the rest of the engine. They just rotate via the hot gases passing through them on their way out of the engine. Okay, so to feed the engine we need two things. We need fuel and we need oil, and without either of those this engine is just not going to work very well at all. So the red lines that we can see here, these are all just oil lines, and We have the main oil reservoir in the front, which you'll see in a moment, and that feeds in, and it feeds all the bearings in the aircraft engine. This engine does not do well without oil. You've got some of the bearings in here that when I'm flying at 100%, they're going to be up around 56,000 RPM, and without being cooled and lubricated by the oil. So oil is really important in a gas turbine engine. If I lose engine oil pressure, I'm straight down to the ground. If I completely lose all pressure, I'm going to be shutting the aircraft engine down in flight, and I'm going to be auto rotating down to the ground. So engine oil is really important in this engine. So we have here, we've got a kind of our oil pump, and we have a small oil filter in there, and then this guy here is our fuel control unit. And the line coming in here is from the fuel shutoff valve that I mentioned earlier on. This all here is a stainless steel firewall, and if I have a fire in the engine bay, it contains the fire to the engine bay and doesn't allow it to spread to the transmission, because I kind of want to keep my rotor system in the event of a fire, and that's the only way I'm going to get down alive. So we have the stainless steel firewall that the fuel comes through. It comes into the fuel control unit, and we have basically this linkage here is from the throttle. So as I'm starting the engine, I'm feeding more fuel and more fuel and more fuel into the engine. Once I'm up to flight RPM, that throttle just stays down and doesn't move. The bottom one is my collective. So when I raise the collective, I need more power from the engine to overcome the blade pitch or the drag created by the blades, because as you increase your blade pitch, it creates more drag. So think of it like, you know, when you were a kid and you stuck your hand out the car window like this, it flies through the air nice. When you then turn your hand, it gets blown upwards and back. Upwards because it's creating lift, and backwards because it's creating drag. So the more I raise the collective, more drag it creates, so I need more power to push these rotor blades through the air, and that's how that does it. So as I raise collective, changes the pitch on the blades, and it asks for more fuel. So as it asks for more fuel, pulls more fuel in, sends it into the engine, gives me more bang, more power, and allows the aircraft to go up or go faster. So that is the fuel control unit. There's a lot of pipes and wires and things over it, and that's just mainly just the design of the engine. So when I'm doing my visual inspection, I'm just going to go around, make sure there's no leaks, there's nothing loose, there's no wires that are broken, anything like that. The other cool thing that we have on this engine is a fire detection system. So I have a couple of fire sensors, one down here, one over here, and one that you can see just here, and they are just like a bimetallic strip, and if they get too hot, makes the circuit, sends up a warning light in the front to say that I've got a fire in the engine bay. So that way then I can just shut the fuel off and auto rotate down to the ground. So it's a nice handy feature to have. So again, nice clean engine, doesn't leak oil. I can come in and I can give it a quick visual inspection. It's nice and easy to see. Every now and then there's a bit of like oil residue, so you just wipe that up. But apart from that, the Ariel 1D1 engine is awesome. So next, coming down the back of the aircraft, we have the tail boom, and the tail boom is a hollow tail boom. We just have spars inside that go all the way down, and along the top we have the tail rotor drive shaft that sits in this cupboard here. The tail boom basically holds kind of three things. We have the horizontal stabilizer just here, we have the vertical stabilizer up there, and we have on the other side, we have the tail rotor gearbox. So we're going to go around to those, and I'm going to show you what each of those does to help the aircraft fly nicely through the air. So here we have the horizontal stabilizer, and if you look at the profile of this, it's actually like an upside down wing of an aircraft. And the reason why it's upside down is it creates a lower pressure on the bottom than it does on the top. So what it does is it kind of sucks the wing down as it's traveling through the air. And the reason we want it to go down is that when you fly in a helicopter, there's my guy, when you fly in a helicopter, most of them fly. My blades are a bit wonky there. My son doesn't know I've stole his aircraft, so I'm probably going to get yelled at when I get back home. So when we're flying along, most helicopters will fly kind of in a nose down attitude like this. A lot of the bigger ones have the actual main rotor tilted, and they use what's called a flat floor concept, so they can fly flat through the air. But in an A-Star like this, we don't have that luxury, so the aircraft is going to be tilted forward and we're flying like this. The faster you go, the more it tilts forward. So what the horizontal stabilizer does is it tries to pull the back end down so that when we're flying along, we're not as far forward. I remember when I was in flight school and I was flying the Schweitzer, holy, you do 60-70 knots in that thing and you can feel like you're falling out the front. You're resting on your basically seat harness, and that is because it's so far forward. This stays flat because of the horizontal stabilizer. So then we have the vertical fin, and the vertical fin is to help pull the aircraft through the air with the tail following directly behind you. And it works really well above like 20 to 40 knots, and what it does is keeps the aircraft straight, and it also helps to take off some of the load of the tail rotor, especially at higher speeds. So when it's flying along, that's the profile of a wing, and it's just like a weather vane on the top of a house. It basically wants to point into the wind and keep the tail flying directly behind you, so you're not flying kind of sideways through the air. Works really well. And if we have a tail drive failure or a pitch failure on the tail rotor, we can actually use a forward airspeed to keep the helicopter pointing forward even though the tail rotor is not working very well, and that allows us to do a run-on landing and allows everybody to walk away safely. So this is the horizontal stabilizer and the vertical stabilizer. So here we have the tail rotor, and on the A-Star this is just a two-bladed tail rotor. When you get up to the bigger machines, they can have 4 tail rotor blades on there to help produce more thrust so that they can have smaller blades on there. But for the A-Star we've got 2. The main tail rotor rotates at about 2080-85 RPM. So you look at the main rotor which was doing like 394. This is about a 5-to-1 ratio, so for every turn the main rotor does, the tail rotor turns 5 times, and the tail rotor and the main rotor are connected via gears. So there's a common misconception that the pilot alters the tail rotor control by changing the speed, and that's not correct. The main rotor cannot turn without the tail rotor turning. It's a mechanical linkage, and when one turns the other one does, unless you have a problem. The way that as a pilot that we change the direction of the aircraft, so my helicopter, so if we want to get the helicopter this way and then I want to point it this way in a hover, we do that using the tail rotor. So if I want to turn left, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the left pedal, and that's going to turn the aircraft nose to the left. So basically the tail boom is going to come to the right and it's going to push the nose to the left. And it does that by changing the pitch of the blades. So when I push on the pedals, it moves a linkage that comes all the way to the back, moves this, pushes this up and down, this slider up and down, and it transfers that to the pitch links through this rotating coupling. And you can see here in this video, as I push the pedals, it alters the pitch of the tail rotor blades. So the other thing that we have on here is a electrical magnetic chip detector, and what that does is it just sits there in the oil, and if there's any fragments of the gears or anything like that, it's magnetic, so they just attract to the end of it, and there's like a I know, like a little gap in there, and if the metal particles fill that gap, bing, I get a light in the cockpit that tells me that my tail rotor gearbox has potentially some metal being produced in it. So it gives me a nice indication that something might be wrong. I can then land, come out, take it out, have a look, and if it's got a big chunk of metal on the end, then I'm going to be calling maintenance and say, come and have a look because your tail rotor gearbox is producing metal. So that's the tail rotor. It's really simple, works really well. It's a nice big tail rotor on the A-Star. It has what we call lots of authority, so things like wind and operating at high altitudes, when I'm operating under heavy weights, so I'm slinging something really heavy or I've got a lot of people on board, it gives me a lot of control, because you may have seen on videos where helicopters end up spinning around, and that's because they've lost tail rotor authority. But the A-Star is awesome. You treat it well, this thing never bites you, and it's really nice. The problem with it being a nice big tail rotor is that it comes down lower. So I have to be really careful when I'm landing in the bush, because the tail rotor sits on me, it's about mid-waist height. So if I'm landing out in unprepared sites, which is pretty much all the time, things like little trees. It's alright, that's just we have a load of fuel drums sitting over there, and when they expand in the heat they give a big boom. So when I'm landing in the bush, if I don't plan my spot for my tail rotor to go, and I have like one little willow sticking up or something, and it hits that tail rotor, then it's what's classed as a sudden stoppage, and I have to have engineers come out and look and see what kind of potential damage has been caused on the tail rotor. So that's a busy airport today. Another A-Star taking off. So depending on how much green or brown is on the tips of here, they have to do an inspection and look all the way down the tail boom. And if I've hit something substantial with it, it could be completely scrapped. So that would be tail rotor blades, tail rotor gearbox, drive shaft, possibly the gears in the transmission. You know, before you know it, you can be up to 100 grand screw up just because I didn't put my tail rotor in the right place and I hit something. So yeah, tail rotor is big, it's awesome, but it can be a real pain in the rear end. To help protect the tail rotor a little bit more, we have this thing right here called a stinger, and what that does is it just allows the aircraft to come in, especially more when we're training. You can come in and you can flare it, because as you flare, as you come down to the ground, as you can see, the tail rotor gets low. So what that does is, if I come down and I'm going to hit the tail rotor when I'm doing, say, an emergency procedure like an engine off descent, as I come down and flare, if I didn't have that stinger, I could hit the tail rotor, which would then end up spinning the aircraft and crash. Whereas that stinger is going to come down, hit that stinger and protect the tail rotor blade. So tail rotor on this machine is awesome, but it's one of the most important features that I need to protect as a pilot. So this is the right hand side of the engine cowl. We looked on the other side, this is now the right side. So this is the side that sits behind me as the pilot. So we have the engine air intake here. These two black boxes are basically our exciter boxes, and these are what create the high electricity to fire the sparks into the spark plugs during the start procedure. So we've got two boxes, one for each igniter. As we come around, and here we have what we call the thermocouples, and these thermocouples monitor the engine at what we call our T4 stage. So this is our T4 temperature, and this gives me a good indication of how hot the engine is running, especially when I'm pulling power. The more power I pull, the hotter it gets. So that can become one of my limitations when I'm working the aircraft. So the T4s are monitored there. We have the main drive transmission, a drive shaft that drives the transmission that goes through at the back. We have some little magnetic chip plugs here and here, just the same as the tail rotor one. They just are magnetic, so if the engine starts to produce any metal, at the end of the day I can take those out and have a look, and if there's metal on there, I can then inform the engineer to come and have a look. What we have here is the starter generator. So when I press the starter button to get the engine started, what this does is, just like your starter on your car, it basically starts turning the engine through the accessory gearbox here, starts turning it over. Once the start cycle is completed and the engine's up to 45% RPM, I can release that starter button, and the engine will then be self-sustaining. What that does is it then changes from being a starter to a generator, so it then produces electrical energy that feeds back into the aircraft so that it can run all my instrumentation, all my gauges, all my warning system, electrical boost, fuel pumps, that kind of thing, so that they're not just running off the battery. So once the aircraft is started, this thing is basically self-sustaining, like I said before, and providing it's got fuel and oil, it's going to stay running until I shut it off. The red wires are for what we have is called a Tannis system, and it's like electrical pads. You probably can't see it. I'll show you in a moment when we go to here, but we have like electrical heating pads on all of the gearboxes and on parts of the engine, so that when it's cold and we're operating, you know, -20, -25, we can plug the aircraft in to the power overnight, and it keeps all the engine nice and warm and the oil's warm, because like I said, if we don't get oil running around this thing when it's running, it does not do any good to the bearings and the components inside. So we want our oil warm and fluid so it can do its job. So that's what these red wires are, and that's the right hand side of the 1D1 Ariel engine. So now we have the right hand side transmission cowl, or at least underneath it anyway, and the main thing that you can probably see here straight away is this big green tank. Eurocopter like to use this kind of funny blue-green colour. Don't know why, but they do. So this is our engine oil reservoir, and it provides the oil basically to our engine. So we have the oil that kind of flows out. Down here we have a magnetic chip detector, so that if there's any oil if there's any metal particles floating around in the oil, this is going to pick it up as soon as it comes out of the reservoir. So one of the things we want to check, and yeah, basically flows oil through to the engine. Down here we have our, it's like a bypass valve. So if the oil is too cold, like when we first start up at -25, we don't want the oil going up to the cooling fan at the front and cooling the oil when it's already cold. So this bypass is like a temperature controlled device, and it just reroutes the oil straight back to the reservoir. In the summer, when the oil is hot, we want to send the oil all the way through and get cooled down before coming back to the reservoir. So that's what this little guy does here. This guy here is our hydraulic pump, and it's quite an important device, because without hydraulics this machine is, it's not tough to fly, but it's really stiff, and it can really tire you out if you've got to fly a little bit of a distance. Like if you're over water and you need to fly to get this aircraft down the ground. So the hydraulic pump is really important. It drives our power steering. It's just belt driven off the main drive shaft that comes from the engine. So it, every time the blades are turning, the hydraulics are running, provided the belt doesn't snap. So we've got another magnetic chip plug there, which is used to look for metal particles in the hydraulic fluid, because again, we don't want particles going into the hydraulics, because then they can jam the hydraulic servos, which can then be really bad, because you've got jammed controls, you can't fly. So that's quite a nasty scenario. So above it up here we've got the hydraulic reservoir, hydraulic fluid reservoir, and we just have sight gauges. These little round black dots on there are just a glass, so we can look through and we can just make sure we've got the right amount of oil and hydraulic fluid in there. Here we have our hydraulic or shut off solenoid, and what that does is, if we detect that we've got a problem with the hydraulic system, I can turn off a switch in the cockpit and it shuts off the hydraulics. So it's better to fly the aircraft with no hydraulics than hydraulics with no fluid in it, or intermittent. So I can shut the hydraulic system off, and that's what that does there. The black lines are the oil coming back to the oil reservoir. This line here goes up to the back of the engine, which basically puts air into it, which pressurizes it. The transmission is mounted to the aircraft via 4 torque tubes, one here, and two on the other side. So basically, when the aircraft, or when the transmission moves through the flight controls, the rest of the aircraft kind of follows with it, a bit like a pendulum really. So I'm basically controlling the main rotor via the transmission, and the rest of the aircraft fuselage hangs underneath and follows like that. So that's how the load of the transmission is connected to the aircraft. It's also connected at the bottom here, which you can't really see, and that stops the transmission twisting within the fuselage. So it can move slightly with like rubber mounts, but generally the aircraft is going to follow the transmission. So on this side we've got another push-pull tube that I mentioned earlier on. We have three. It goes up to the hydraulic actuators, which then move the main rotor head, and we're going to go up and have a look at those in a moment, so you can get a bit more of an idea of how the movements from my flight controls go into the main rotor blades. But that is pretty much it for this side. Again, it's nice and clear and open, it's easy to look at everything. So that is the right hand transmission cowling area. So here we are up on the top of the helicopter, and the main transmission is mounted right down here, and these are the top of the push-pull tubes, or the hydraulic actuators. We have the three that are connected to the push-pull tubes earlier on. So this guy here is called the swash plate, and there's kind of two halves to it. We have the fixed half, which stays fixed, and then we have the rotating half, and this is basically all one unit. It's got like a spherical bearing in the middle, so the swash plate can rotate around on the bearing, and what this does is it transfers the flight controls that I make into the rotor head. So when I raise on the collective, the whole swash plate comes up. As it comes up, it transfers that movement via these three push-pull tubes, or the pitch links as they're called, into each rotor blade. And by moving the cyclic, what I can do, let's say if I want to move the cyclic forward, unfortunately I can't do that on this aircraft to show you, because the flight controls need to be rotating, so the aircraft needs to be running to show how the swash plate works. I can show with the collective, but not with the cyclic. So what this does, let's say if I want to go to the right, what it'll do is it'll rotate the swash plate, or tilt the swash plate, which will put the pitch links higher as each blade rides around. So when you look at the aircraft main rotor when it's spinning, it's like a disc. So the disc will be higher on the left hand side, lower on the right hand side, and it will move the aircraft in that direction. So we have a boot here that just protects the shaft as the swash plate goes up and down. Each pitch link connects to the blade, each main rotor blade. So we have three on the A-Star, 1, 2, 3. So each blade is connected to the hub via what's called the star, the fixed star. And this is like it's a epoxy resin glass fiber kind of material, and what this thing does is it holds all the three blades in position, and it allows the blades to move through elastomeric bearings. And what they are is like a laminate of rubber and metal, so that they can kind of twist and move. So the blades can twist or feather this way using this bearing, and then they can flap up and down through this bearing and this bearing here, and they can then drag very slightly using these two bearings. So it's a very unique system that's only on the Eurocopter machines, but it works really well. So yeah, so that is pretty much the rotor head. The other thing we have is up at the top here, we have a big huge weight right in the middle, and we have three springs that push into it and keep that weight in the middle, and that's to help dampen vibration when the aircraft is flying, and it also helps to stop it getting what's called ground resonance, so sitting there on the ground doing this. So that is pretty much the rotor head. It's really simple, there's not a lot to it, and that's unfortunately because of the design of it and these elastomeric bearings, I can't move it when it's on the ground and it's not running. So hopefully if I get a chance before I edit this video, I'll see if I can find another helicopter around, like a Jet Ranger, that we can do it. But the company I work for, we don't have any Jet Rangers here, it's all A-Stars, so kind of limited to what I can show you. But yeah, it's yeah, again, awesome part of the machine. So now we're back down under the main road ahead. This is the right hand side cargo bay, and it's not the cargo area, but it's generally where the pilot keeps all their stuff, because it's right behind where the pilot sits. So I let the customers put all their junk in the utility basket, the tail boom compartment, and in the left hand cargo bay where my fueling gear is. And I like to keep my stuff out here. So at the moment it's quite wet out there, so I've always got my rubber boots. I got my flight bag that's just got my personal stuff in, so a flashlight, Leatherman, things like that, spare personal GPS just in case mine breaks, maps, charts, things like that. We also have in here a saw and an axe as part of our survival equipment, and the yellow guy right here is a 7-man 5-day survival kit that we need to have by law on the aircraft. So if we have an emergency and we have to go sit down in the bush, we can survive pretty easily out there. The other thing we have here is our ELT, also known as our emergency locator transmitter. And what that does is it does two things. One, if I activate it via a switch on the instrument panel, or it goes off automatically if it detects a hard impact. So in the event of an aircraft crash, this thing is going to fire off an emergency signal, goes up to the satellite, and it basically goes off and sends my information of the aircraft and the coordinates. So something that's not nice to think about, but in the event of an emergency or a crash, the ELT is going to get the emergency services coming to our location. So it's really nice to have. Now earlier on when I was talking about those Tannis pads, this is where we plug the machine in. So when we are operating in winter and we've got to go flying, unfortunately at -20, -30, it's damn cold, but hey, work needs to go. We'll plug the aircraft in, and then that sends power up to all the electrical heated Tannis pads that are all over the engine and transmission. So the other cool thing about it is we've got a little red LED there, so when you're in camp or something like that, you can just keep sticking your head out the window, out through the curtain or the blinds at night, just to make sure you can see that red light. Because the worst thing as a pilot is when you come out in the morning to get the machine ready for the job, and the circuit breaker tripped at 11 o'clock the night before, and now the aircraft is an ice cube because we ain't going to be going anywhere. So now we're under the belly of the beast, so to speak, and there's two kind of cool things under here. One is these big black things called the bear paws, and what the bear paws do are prevent the aircraft from sinking when we land, because the bear paws pretty much directly under the main transmission and the engine, so the majority of the weight of the aircraft. And if we go and sit on soft ground, the aircraft can start to sink, and the aircraft sinks, tail rotor gets closer to the ground, and there are incidences where aircraft have been sitting there and are starting to sink, and then before you know it, the tail rotor's under the water, especially in the swampy ground like what we have around here where I fly. So the bear paws basically just provide a bigger surface area, called a bear paw because they've got big surface area, big pads, stops the back end of the aircraft sinking in. So usually when I'm flying and I'm going into areas that I know is soft ground, I'll try and find a log or a rock, and I'll use my mirrors to line up the bear paws with the log and then set down on the log, and then it puts the aircraft a bit higher, keeps the tail up out of the weeds and the willows and the brush and the junk. So bear paws, really handy. Second thing is our external cargo swing, as it is on this one. The swing basically is free to move around, and it's fixed to the fuselage in 4 points, so it helps to spread the load across the fuselage rather than from a single point. It's unique to the kind of the Eurocopter A-Stars. This is how they decided to do it. It works good. And in the middle of the cargo swing we have the cargo hook. and the cargo hook is what we mount our 125 foot long lines to, that we can then use to move external cargo or fire buckets when we're going on the fires. So the cargo hook is mounted on the belly, and it has a couple of things to it. It has a mechanical release, so that if I pull the mechanical lever on the collective in emergency, I can jettison the load. It also has, seriously, you try to do videos and everybody seems to make noise. That's the way it goes, right? So it has the mechanical release from the bicycle brake, as we nickname it, and it also has an electrical release, so that when I press a button on the cyclic, it electrically releases the hook and it can drop the long line out. So there's two ways for me to release this hook. It also has what's called a load cell on it, so the hook hangs on a little device that basically monitors the weight. So when I'm picking something up, if it starts to get too heavy, I can see on my little weigh gauge there, and then I can put the load back down, tell the guys, hey, you've put too much junk in that net, take some stuff out. So that's really handy to have too. So that is the cargo hook. It's really cool. Well guys, that is the tour of the B2 Astar. I hope you enjoyed it. I've been wanting to do this video for a long time. I have so many of my friends and people asking, like, hey, what's under the cowls? Can we have a look? Let's have a look at the engine. Being an engineering kind of guy myself, I love seeing stuff like this. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, give that subscribe button a push, hit that notify bell so you know exactly when all my videos have come out. I'm making cool stuff like this all the time. If you can give me a like, I'd love that. It really helps the channel out. If you have any questions, stick them in the comments below. I love to hear what you guys want to see, and we'll get the video out. We'll come over to the machine and we'll get your questions answered. Make sure you check out our other videos. I've got a detailed look at the inside of the cabin here. I've got a detailed look at the engine, plus loads of other great stuff. So if you subscribe to the channel, go in, have a look at all the videos. We've got really good stuff, and hope you find this interesting. I love doing them, so the more you want to see, the more I'm going to do. So get those comments out, and I'll see you on the next one.